Beneath the forest floor of northern Cambodia, buried under centuries of roots and fallen leaves and silence, there lies a city so large and so organized that it would have rivaled the great urban centers of medieval Europe, and no one who walked through that jungle knew it was there. Beneath the forest canopy of northern Cambodia, a city of several 100,000 people lay hidden for centuries, its streets and temples so thoroughly wrapped in roots and shadow that the world had simply forgotten it was there. The forest that covered it is not a gentle thing, even now. In the provinces north of the Great Lake called the Tonle Sap, the trees grow tall and close, their upper branches locking together into a ceiling so dense that the light reaching the floor below is dim and green and arrives in no particular direction, more like a mood than a source. A person standing among those trunks at midday exists in something closer to dusk, a permanent half-light that softens edges and flattens distances and makes it genuinely difficult to judge how far one has walked or what shape the land beneath the feet is taking. The ground itself is not a simple surface. It rises and dips in ways that seem random until they are not. Ridges and hollows that might be the work of water or of time or of something older, something placed deliberately long ago and then left alone long enough for the forest to finish covering it. Roots from the larger trees travel outward for many meters in every direction, pressing through soil, working into every crack and crevice, slowly dismantling anything solid they encounter, or simply growing around it until the original shape is lost beneath a thick skin of bark and moss. Vines hang from the branches above and root themselves below, creating vertical walls of greenery that divide the space into chambers, each one dim and quiet and containing nothing visible that would tell a person where they were or what had once stood there. Stone does not stop this process. It slows it perhaps, but even the hardest carved sandstone, the kind the Khmer builders used throughout this region, eventually yields to the patient pressure of a fig tree's roots or the slow colonization of lichen and moss. A wall becomes a mound becomes a rise in the ground. A rise in the ground becomes simply part of the landscape, indistinguishable from any other irregularity, and the forest moves all over it without ceremony. There is a particular quality to the silence in this kind of forest. It is not empty. Birds move through the upper canopy, insects fill the air with a constant low presence, and occasionally something larger passes through the undergrowth at a distance. But the sound never arrives clearly. The trees absorb and scatter it, and what reaches a person standing still in the middle of it all is a kind of ambient murmur, directionless and soft, that seems to come from the forest itself rather than from anything in it. This is a place that keeps its own counsel, that processes everything that enters it and returns nothing in a recognizable form. The concealment here is not aggressive. The forest does not reach out and grab or actively resist. It simply continues, at its own pace, doing what forests do, growing, spreading, cycling through seasons that, in this latitude, are not marked by cold and warmth, but by rain, and its absence, the wet months that accelerate everything, and the dry months that pause it slightly before it begins again. Over the course of a human lifetime, the change is perceptible, but not dramatic. Over the course of many lifetimes, it is total. What makes this forest unusual? What makes this particular stretch of northern Cambodia different from many other forests in the world is what the slow accumulation of centuries has buried inside it. Not a ruin or two, not a scattering of old foundations, but an entire urban landscape. Roads that once carried thousands of people, platforms that once held temples visible from a great distance, reservoirs that once held enough water to sustain a city through months of dry heat, and the whole invisible geometry of a civilization that organized itself across many square kilometers of ground with the same care and intention that goes into building any large planned city anywhere in the world. All of it is still there beneath the roots and the leaf litter and the slowly accumulating soil of centuries. None of it has moved. The stones are where they were placed. The channels are where they were dug. The roads are where they were laid out by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and did it well enough that even after everything that has grown over them, the underlying logic of the place remains, patient and intact, waiting in the green half-dark beneath the trees. The forest did not erase the city suddenly. It took its time, as forests do, advancing year by year across surfaces that had once been maintained by thousands of people, and then, for reasons that folded together slowly over centuries, shifting political centers, diminishing populations, the quiet withdrawal of organized labor from a place that had once hummed with it, were maintained no longer. Vines found the edges of stone platforms and began their patient work. Roots pushed into the joints between cut blocks with a pressure so gradual it was indistinguishable from stillness. The rainy seasons came and went, each one depositing a thin film of organic matter that dried and compacted and eventually became something resembling soil. Trees grew where no trees had grown before, because the ground beneath was rich and the structures beneath that ground held moisture in the dry months. In this way, the city did not disappear so much as it became incorporated into the living fabric of the forest, which is not the same thing as vanishing, though from the outside it produces the same effect. People continued to live near the city throughout this process. They had always lived near it. The villages that sat at the margins of the forest were not new arrivals. Many of them had roots in the same broad cultural world that had built the mounds and causeways now dissolving quietly beneath the canopy. Their relationship to the forest was intimate and practical. They knew which trees produced useful timber and which produced useful fruit. They knew the paths between settlements, many of which followed routes that were older than memory, older than the oldest story anyone could tell about them. Some of those paths ran directly over the packed earth causeways of the city, now softened by centuries of growth, but still subtly elevated above the surrounding ground, still subtly firmer underfoot. The people who walked these paths felt nothing unusual. A slightly raised stretch of ground in a forest is a slightly raised stretch of ground. It does not announce itself. Monks moved through this landscape as well, following trails between small temples and forest monasteries, some of which sat on ground that had once been part of the larger settlement. The religious geography of the region had its own deep continuity. Sacred sites accumulated meaning over long spans of time, and some of the places where monks rested or prayed had been considered significant for longer than the written record went back, though the reasons for that significance had shifted and been reinterpreted many times over. A carved stone block incorporated into a later shrine wall, a foundation that sat slightly too regular in its dimensions to have occurred naturally. These things were present, and they were noticed in a general way, but they did not suggest to anyone walking past them that something vast lay just beyond the edge of vision, organized and intact beneath the undergrowth. Researchers working in the region during the 20th century were not unaware that there was history in the forest. The broader Khmer world had produced monuments of staggering scale and sophistication, and it was well understood that the great temple complexes to the south were not isolated achievements but nodes in a larger system of urban life. The northern highlands had been explored by scholars working on foot and on horseback, and later by those studying aerial photographs taken from helicopters and light aircraft. Those photographs were useful. They revealed a great deal about the landscape and helped locate features that ground surveys had missed. But ordinary aerial photography sees what light sees, and light, bouncing back from a dense jungle canopy, sees the canopy. The surface of the treetops is smooth and continuous and green and entirely uninformative about what lies 40 or 50 meters below. Researchers identified individual ruins, noted their presence in the scholarly record, and moved on, understanding that the forest made systematic survey extremely difficult and that what they were seeing was fragmentary. What no one could do with the tools available was step back far enough to see the whole thing at once. The individual pieces were there. The raised paths, The occasional stone face peering out of the undergrowth, the depressions that filled with water in the rainy season and held their shape too consistently to be natural. These were observed, catalogued, discussed in academic literature. But the picture they formed together was not visible because the frame was too large and the canopy was in the way. It is something like trying to read a sentence by examining one letter at a time, each one isolated in a different room. The letters are legible. The sentence remains out of reach. This is the particular quality of the secret the forest kept. It was not a secret of distance, the way a ruin on a remote coastline or a desert plateau might be hidden simply by being far from anywhere. It was a secret of density. The city was close to everything. It was close to the villages and the paths and the monks and the researchers. It was close enough that children playing in the undergrowth ran their hands along its stones. It was close enough that farmers working fields at the forest margin were planting in soil that contained, a little deeper down, the material remains of an organized urban civilization. The distance between the known world and the unknown one was measured in meters, sometimes in centimeters, in the thickness of root mat and accumulated leaf fall, and the slow, patient work of the forest reclaiming what had once been cleared and shaped and inhabited. A secret kept this way has a particular texture. It does not feel like distance. It feels like ordinariness. The trees look like trees. The ground feels like ground. The slightly raised path feels like something the landscape produced naturally, because by now the landscape has incorporated it so thoroughly that the distinction between what is natural and what was made has softened past easy detection. Generations of people walked through this place, living their lives fully, looking at what there was to look at, noticing what was noticeable, and the city rested beneath all of that activity, present at every moment, patient in the way that stone is patient, which is to say almost entirely indifferent to the passage of time. The aircraft that finally disturbed that patience was not a dramatic arrival. It was a small plane moving methodically across the sky above northern Cambodia, following planned lines back and forth the way a person mows a field, each pass overlapping the last by a careful margin. The whole flight organized less like exploration and more like a slow, thorough reading of a very large page. Mounted in the plane was an instrument that fired pulses of light downward toward the forest, each pulse a discrete event, a brief, precise emission aimed at whatever lay below. The instrument fired these pulses at a rate that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once, hundreds of thousands of them every second, each one leaving the instrument and traveling downward at the speed of light, which is to say nearly instantaneously by any ordinary measure of time. The pulses passed through the air, encountered the canopy, and some of them stopped there, bouncing back from the surfaces of leaves and branches and the upper tangle of the forest. But light moves in straight lines, and the forest, even the dense forest of northern Cambodia, is not a solid ceiling. It has gaps. Narrow ones, temporary ones, gaps between leaves where a beam of light no wider than a fingertip could pass through before the canopy closed again above it. Some portion of every burst of pulses made it through. They traveled the remaining distance to the ground, struck soil or stone or root, and returned upward. Each returning pulse arrived back at the instrument, a tiny fraction of a second after it left, and because the speed of light is known with extraordinary precision, that tiny fraction of a second translates directly into a distance. The instrument measured how long the journey took and recorded it, pulse by pulse by pulse, hundreds of thousands of times per second across the full width of the aircraft's flight path below. By the time the plane had completed its passes over the survey area and the researchers had returned the data to the processing stage, what they had was not yet a map. It was an enormous cloud of points, each point representing one returned pulse, each point carrying a precise record of how far it had traveled. Points from the upper canopy clustered near the top. Points from the mid-story, from branches and the understory vegetation clustered below those. and points from the ground itself sat lower still, a separate population of returns that had made the full journey down and back. Separating these populations from one another was the central work of the processing stage, and it was work that required neither particular drama nor any especially rare expertise by the time this survey was conducted. The methods had been developed and refined over years of similar work elsewhere. Software examined the cloud of points and applied filters based on the geometry of how forest canopy and ground returns behave differently, how a point that bounced back from a leaf tends to appear alongside other leaf-level points in ways that have a recognizable character, how ground returns cluster and behave differently from vegetation returns, how the two populations can be sorted and separated with a degree of accuracy that would have seemed remarkable only a generation earlier. The leaf returns were set aside. The branch returns were set aside. What remained, isolated from all the vegetative noise above it, was a surface. The bare earth itself, rendered as a field of points, each one a small, precise measurement of where the ground actually was beneath the forest that had hidden it. When that surface was rendered visually, when the points were assembled into something a human eye could read as a landscape, the result was not the featureless terrain that a person walking through the forest might have expected to find. It was not the gentle, undulating ground of a natural hillside, unmarked and uncomplicated. The surface that emerged from the processed data had structure. It had regularity. It had the kind of geometry that forests do not produce on their own. The lines were too straight. The depressions were too rectangular. The rises were too measured in their spacing and their orientation to have arrived at those arrangements through erosion or the slow drift of soil over centuries. The instrument had seen what centuries of ordinariness had kept invisible, not by penetrating the forest in any mystical or metaphorical sense, but simply by being precise enough and patient enough in its mechanical way to catch the small fraction of light that the canopy allowed through, and to listen carefully to what came back. The city had always been there, and now there was a record of it. The researchers who first looked at the processed maps spent time simply orienting themselves, the way a person does when stepping into a very large room whose full dimensions take a moment to absorb. The data had resolved into something that was not ambiguous. There were streets. Not paths worn into the earth by deer or by the casual movement of water downhill, but streets in the proper sense. Corridors of flattened ground running parallel to one another at regular intervals, meeting other corridors at right angles, forming a grid that stretched across the survey area in a pattern that spoke of planning, of measurement, of a society that had organized its ground before it built upon it. The mound sat within that grid with the deliberateness of furniture arranged in a room. They rose in places where the street plan opened into wider spaces, and their profiles on the elevation map, the way the ground sloped up in smooth, symmetrical lines and then leveled at the top before descending again, were not the profiles of hills. Hills accumulate through processes that are neither symmetrical nor intentional. These mounds had been constructed, shaped, packed, and oriented. Some of them ran along a cardinal axis, aligned with the rising or setting sun at particular times of year, though the forest overhead had kept that orientation invisible for so long that no one walking among the trees would have felt it. Seen from above in the elevation data, it was unmistakable. Between the mounds and along the edges of the larger open spaces, the reservoirs appeared as rectangular depressions pressed into the ground. Dark, flat-bottom shapes whose proportions were too regular to be natural. In a wet climate, the ground fills with water where the earth is low, and there are ponds throughout the region that formed without any human intention. But a natural pond is oval or irregular, shaped by the path of least resistance and the contours of existing terrain. These depressions were rectangular, their corners close to right angles, their banks running in straight lines. They were water storage basins, built to hold the monsoon rains through the dry season, and there were many of them, distributed across the city in a pattern that suggested not improvisation but a system, a hydraulic infrastructure that had been laid out at the same time. The streets and the mounds were laid out as part of the same original act of design. The causeways appeared slightly raised above the surrounding ground, long narrow spines of packed earth crossing the low-lying areas between districts. Where the terrain dipped into what had once been channels or seasonal flooding zones, the causeways bridged them, carrying the lines of movement across the city without interruption. They connected one part of the grid to another, and following them on the elevation map had the quality of tracing the veins of a leaf, each major route branching into smaller ones, each smaller one leading eventually to an open space or a mound or a reservoir, the whole network organized around circulation and access in a way that was recognizably urban. What struck the researchers most, and what continued to settle into the understanding of the site over time, was the sheer scale of the organization. A city is not simply a collection of buildings. It is a collection of decisions. Decisions about where roads go, how water is managed, which spaces are left open and which are built upon, how the movement of people is channeled and eased or directed. All of those decisions leave marks in the ground, and the lidar had preserved those marks in extraordinary detail. The city that emerged from the data was not a cluster of monuments surrounded by forest. It was a functioning urban landscape, planned at a scale that implied a population large enough to require that level of infrastructure and sophisticated enough to execute it. Walking through the forest above this city, as researchers and villagers and monks had done for centuries, a person would have been walking through the streets without knowing it. The ground underfoot in certain areas would have been slightly more level than elsewhere, and slightly more open between the trees, because the old streets had resisted the encroachment of vegetation a little more than the areas on either side. The mounds would have appeared to be low hills, unremarkable in a landscape full of undulation. The reservoir depressions would have been marshy spots where water pooled in the rainy season, useful perhaps for the animals that came to drink, but not obviously different from any other low ground. The causeways would have been the paths that felt most natural to walk along, which is why some of them were still being walked. The old infrastructure of the city expressing itself as convenience, as the ground's gentle preference for certain routes, without ever announcing what it was. In the elevation data, all of that dissolved ambiguity became form. The streets became streets. The mounds became mounds. The reservoirs became reservoirs. The city assembled itself out of the numbers, as surely as a face assembles itself from light when the eye adjusts to a dim room, not gradually or partially, but all at once in the way that recognition works, the pattern arriving complete even before the mind has fully processed the individual elements. There it was, laid out in the Cambodian forest, a city that had been resting in place for the better part of a millennium, patient and legible, waiting for an instrument precise enough to see it. The city had a name, or at least a name has come down through inscriptions carved into stone across the wider region. Mahendraparvata, a word that carries within it the sense of a mountain sacred to a great lord, a name that points toward both geography and devotion at once. The Phnom Kulen Plateau, where much of this urban network spread across the high ground north of the lowland plains, was understood in its own time as a place of elevated significance, a place where the terrestrial and the divine were arranged in deliberate proximity. The people who built there were not working at the margins of a civilization. They were at its center or very near it, in the period when the Khmer world was still finding the forms it would hold for centuries. The Khmer Empire, at the height of its reach, occupied a territory that extended across much of what is now mainland Southeast Asia. Cambodia, parts of Thailand, Laos and Vietnam, all falling within its administrative and cultural orbit at various points across roughly 6 centuries. It was not an empire built on conquest alone, though conquest played its part. It was built, in large measure, on water. The lowlands of Cambodia are crossed by the Mekong River and surrounded by the Tonle Sap, a lake that swells dramatically each monsoon season as the Mekong backs up into it, then drains away again as the rains end and the river drops. A civilization that learned to manage that rhythm, to store water against the dry months and distribute it across fields through a network of canals and reservoirs and earthen embankments, could support a population far larger than the land's natural state would otherwise allow. The Khmer engineers who built that system were doing something that had few parallels in the world at the time. Coordinating water across enormous distances, aligning agricultural capacity with political organization, making the landscape itself a kind of infrastructure. Mahendraparvata sits in the earlier part of that story. The plateau city was taking shape in the 9th century when the political foundations of what would become the classical Khmer state were still being laid. The great temple complexes further south, including the one the world now knows as Angkor Wat, came later, built over a period of centuries beginning in the early 12th century, the product of accumulated wealth and organizational capacity that had been developing across the preceding generations. The city, revealed beneath the Phnom Kulen canopy, was not a provincial outpost or a ceremonial site visited only occasionally. It was a working urban center, inhabited and administered, connected to the religious and political life of a civilization in the process of becoming what it would be. That process of becoming is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the texture of what the lidar data shows. The streets and reservoirs and temple mounds are not simply evidence of a place where people lived. They are evidence of a society working out, in stone and earth and water, a set of ideas about how cities should be organized, how sacred space should be arranged in relation to domestic space, how water should move through a landscape to sustain the people living in it. The Khmer world was deeply interested in the symbolic order of the built environment, the idea that a well-made city could mirror the structure of the cosmos, with temples at its center rising like mountains, water surrounding them as the ocean was understood to surround the world. That cosmological thinking was not decoration layered over practical concerns. It was woven into the practical concerns so that the reservoir was also a sacred sea, and the temple mound was also the axis around which everything else organized itself. In the city on the plateau, that organizing logic appears in the data. The temple mounds are not scattered casually across the terrain. They occupy positions that reflect the same geometric and symbolic thinking visible in the great complexes of the lowlands. The causeways that cross what were once open bodies of water create processional routes, paths that a person moving through the city would experience as a structured journey, each stage of the approach to the central sacred space carrying its own significance. This was a city designed to be inhabited not just physically, but experientially, a place whose layout encoded meaning into the act of moving through it. The relationship between this highland city and the later lowland complexes is not one of simple succession, where one thing ended and another began. The Khmer world was continuous, its traditions and architectural vocabularies passing from one generation to the next, developing and elaborating but never breaking entirely from the forms that preceded them. Angkor Wat, when it was built, drew on a long inheritance of Khmer building knowledge and cosmological thinking, much of which had been worked out over the centuries in places like the Phnom Kulen Plateau. The artisans and planners who shaped the lowland temples were working within a tradition, not inventing one from nothing. The sandstone that forms the walls and towers of the great southern temples was quarried from the Phnom Kulen Plateau and transported to the construction sites along a network of purpose-built canals, with rafts carrying the blocks part of the way across open water. The stone that travelers photograph today, the stone whose carvings have been studied for more than a century, came from the same high ground where the lidar surveys revealed the earlier city. The plateau was not simply a precursor to the lowland civilization. It was a physical source of the materials that gave that civilization its most enduring forms. There is something in that continuity that resists the tidier version of history, in which civilizations rise and fall in clean sequence, each one giving way entirely to the next. The Khmer world was long and layered, and the city on the plateau was one layer among many, earlier than some of the things that came after it, contemporary with others, connected across time to the great works that are more familiar to the world today. The forest closed over it, and the lowland cities continued, and eventually also declined, and the jungle moved over those too in its own time, consuming walls and towers and reservoirs with the same patient thoroughness it had brought to the streets of the highland city centuries before. That the highland city survived at all, as legible form beneath the canopy, is partly a testament to the solidity of what was built there. Earthworks and stone arrangements capable of resisting the forest's appetite for long enough to be found. What the forest resisted consuming, it nonetheless reshaped, and the city that the light pulses found was not the city as it had been lived in. It was the city as the earth had preserved it, stripped of its wooden halls and thatched roofs and the daily motion of its people, reduced to the durable geometry of its planning. And that geometry, once visible, turned out to say something important. The scale of the settlement implied a population far larger than anyone had estimated for the highland region. The network of streets and raised embankments and carefully managed water infrastructure did not suggest a ceremonial center, a place visited for ritual and then left quiet. It suggested a working city, a place where many thousands of people had organized their daily lives according to a shared spatial logic. The reservoirs were not decorative. They were functional, sized and positioned to hold and distribute water through a dry season that would otherwise have made the highland plateau difficult to sustain. The causeways connected neighborhoods across low ground that flooded seasonally, meaning that the city's planners had accounted not just for where people would live, but for how they would move through the landscape across all its moods throughout the year. This kind of planning takes time to develop and takes institutional knowledge to execute. It does not appear in a generation. The earthworks alone, the banks and berms and shaped channels that guided water through the settlement, represent an accumulated understanding of the land's behavior, its patterns of rain and runoff and saturation that could only have come from long and careful attention. The people who built this city had studied their ground. They had watched it over enough seasons to know how it behaved, and then they had shaped it, slowly and deliberately, into something that could sustain a dense urban population in a landscape that might otherwise have discouraged one. None of that knowledge was visible from the air before the survey. None of it was legible from the ground, where the earthworks had slumped and blurred over centuries, and the forest had covered their edges with roots and litter until they read as nothing more than gentle rises in the terrain, unremarkable, easily dismissed. The completeness of the concealment is part of what makes the revelation strange to sit with. This was not a city buried under sediment or ash, or the slow rise of new construction on old foundations. It was a city that remained essentially on the surface, where anyone passing through could, in principle, have encountered it. And yet it passed unrecognized for generations, because the forest translated its forms into forest forms, made its streets read as clearings, its mounds as hills, its banks as natural undulations in a landscape full of undulations, in a landscape full of undulations. Researchers continue to work through what the data contains. The maps that emerged from the survey opened questions as readily as they answered them, about which structures were residential and which were administrative, about how the water system was maintained and by whom, about what daily life in the Highland city actually looked like at the height of its occupation. Ground teams have moved through sections of the forest to verify what the lidar images suggested, confirming some features and finding others more ambiguous up close than they appeared in the processed data. The full picture will take years more to assemble. But what is already clear is that the city was a genuine urban achievement, not a loose clustering of settlements, but a coherent, intentional arrangement of space, one that reflected a sophisticated understanding of how large numbers of people can share a landscape without exhausting it. The water management system in particular suggests that the city's planners were thinking on a timescale longer than a single season, longer perhaps than a single lifetime, designing infrastructure whose benefits would accumulate over generations and whose maintenance would need to be organized and sustained by institutions capable of coordinating collective effort. That kind of institution leaves marks in space. The grid does not happen by accident. The alignment of temple mounds does not emerge from informal accumulation. Someone, or some succession of someones, held a vision of what this city should be and found the means to impose that vision on the ground, adjusting it over time as the city grew and as the needs of its population shifted. The lidar data captured the end state of that long process, the city as it had settled by the time it was finally abandoned. But within that end state are traces of earlier arrangements, of streets that were shifted and reservoirs that were expanded and neighborhoods that were reorganized as the city evolved through its long occupation. The forest preserved all of this. Not perfectly, not without loss, but in enough detail that the essential grammar of the city survived intact beneath the canopy, patient and undisturbed and waiting, in its own way, for someone to arrive with the right kind of light. And what is true of this one forest in northern Cambodia is true, in its own way, of forests everywhere. The canopy that swallowed a city along the Phnom Kulen Plateau is not unusual in what it is capable of concealing. Forests of similar density cover enormous portions of the earth. The lowland jungles of Central America, where the Maya built cities whose full extent is still being traced, the vast green interior of the Amazon basin, the old-growth forests of Central Africa, the tangled hill country of mainland Southeast Asia where river valleys and ridgelines have supported human settlement for thousands of years. In all of these places, the relationship between human construction and forest growth follows the same patient logic. Buildings made of earth and stone are consumed slowly, roots finding their way into mortar, trees seeding themselves in the fill of old platforms, the whole architecture of a settlement sinking by degrees into the ground, and the growth above it until the surface of the land reads, to the eye, as unbroken forest. Survey flights using the same light pulse technology that revealed the city in Cambodia have now been conducted in parts of Central America, and the results have been similar in character. Settlements larger and more densely organized than anyone expected before the surveys. Cities connected by roads and canals and raised causeways across wetlands. The evidence of populations that had built and maintained complex infrastructure for centuries before the forest reclaimed it all. The surveys in those regions are still expanding, still resolving, still producing data that takes years to fully process and interpret. And the regions where no such survey has yet been conducted are far larger than the regions where one has. In the Amazon, there are stretches of forest covering areas, the size of small countries, where almost no systematic aerial survey of any kind has been completed. Old accounts from European explorers in the 16th and 17th centuries described, in the language of travelers prone to exaggeration, great cities along the river's tributaries, long roads, large settlements, fields stretching back from the water's edge. For a long time, those accounts were set aside as fantasy or confusion. More recently, researchers working in patches of forest near old river courses have found traces that suggest those accounts were describing something real. Earthworks, the remains of causeways, the deep, dark soil that accumulates only where people have been cooking and farming and living for a very long time. What lies further in, beneath the full depth of the canopy, is largely unknown. Africa's interior forests hold the same kind of patience. In the dense equatorial forest of Central and West Africa, stone and earthwork structures that have been known locally for generations are only beginning to receive sustained outside study. The relationships between those structures, the roads and cleared areas and cultivation terraces that may connect them, the full shape of settlements that may extend far beyond what has been documented, all of this remains, in large part, unresolved. The forest is not hiding it with any intention. It is simply growing, as it has always grown, indifferent to what it covers. Even in places where the forest is younger, second-growth woodland reclaiming land that was farmed or settled within the last few centuries, the speed of concealment is striking. Structures that were in active use a few hundred years ago can become nearly invisible within a few generations of forest growth. The land forgets quickly, in human terms, even when the physical record survives beneath the surface in fine detail. There is something restful in that thought, considered from enough distance. The past does not always disappear. Sometimes it simply becomes very quiet, sinking into the ground and the root systems, and the slow accumulation of leaf litter, preserved in a kind of suspended state that the surface gives no indication of. Cities that were once filled with the ordinary sounds of daily life, water moving through channels, the weight of foot traffic on stone causeways, cooking fires, the work of construction, can rest beneath the canopy for 1,000 years, their geometry intact, their streets still legible to the right kind of attention. The forests that cover them keep growing. The trees do not mark what is beneath them. The canopy closes over everything equally. The temple mound and the old reservoir and the street that ran between them. And from above, from the ordinary altitude of observation, the surface of the world looks continuous and unmarked and entirely natural. But the ground beneath holds its record. And in the long, unhurried way that stone and earth persist through time, the record waits, not for discovery, not for anything so purposeful as waiting, simply resting as the forest rests, as the slow centuries rest, undisturbed and patient in the deep shade beneath the leaves.